Welcome to the Writers at the Wrecking Bar February. This is a record-setting night. We've been doing Writers at the Wrecking Bar for a little over a year, and we've had nice programs, nice crowds, but we've never had anything like this. We've sold out of books before we've even started, so thank you very much. I'm Frank Reese from Acapella Books, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you and to see such a full room. Like I said, Writers at the Wrecking Bar has been a series we've had going for a little over a year. Tony was a part of a previous one last summer with the Atlanta Noir Anthology. He was one of a number of Atlanta writers who contributed. And after he did that, he said, I want to have my book launch here. I said, that sounds like a great idea. So I'm so glad that's worked out. So we've had this series for a little over a year. Acapella Books has been in business now almost 30 years. Thank you. And when we celebrated our 25th about 4 years ago, we put out this anthology of 25 Atlanta writers, and were included in that was Tony Grooms. And as I was thinking of what I was going to say before he comes out and talks about his new book, I was reading back through his contribution to this anthology, and I thought an excerpt from that essay he wrote would be a very nice introduction to his book. So this will take just a few minutes. Bear with me. So, oh sure, I'm not much taller when I stand up, but I'm happy to. So after a few introductory, very nice things that Tony said about our store, he gets into the meat of his essay, which is called Redemption. And he says, few readers deny the transportive power of a well-written literary novel and the occasional less than dumb and dumber movie. Through them, we indulge in the troubles of other people, invented people. We take on their loves, hates, sorrows, and fears. We are appalled by the treachery that is done to them or that they do. We are horrified by the suffering they encounter and endure. From them we take, at the very least, the divertisement of the moment and often a catharsis and or a redemption, whatever we imagine those to be. At best, we are made more humane because reading makes us more sympathetic to other people. To bring about greater sympathy is as good a reason as any to read or to write. Remember, this is Tony's words. I wonder, though, if the current American trend towards literary novels that are, quote, redemptive, might in fact undercut the reader's compulsion toward sympathy. First, what is meant when we say a novel is redemptive, as the word has become a buzz in the promotion of books and movies? The word's most prominent meaning is in that of payment. We redeem coupons at the grocery. American indentured servants were called redemptioners until they had worked off the cost of their migration and keep. Christ paid for our sins by his suffering and dying, and so we are redeemed. In this sense, it seems odd to call reading a novel, quote, redemptive. To do so would suggest that the reader suffers to read it. Writers suffer so that readers should not. In its current usage as applied to novels, the redemptive action of recompense has been supplanted by the effect of salvation, so that the act of reading saves the reader. Doubtlessly, many a soul has been saved by reading a good book. However, the label redemptive novel has become an easy descriptor for a story with a happy ending, an ending that releases the reader from emotional tension by suggesting a hopeful future, if not good fortune, for the characters. In certain stories of realism, such endings also risk releasing the reader from the responsibility to act on the sympathy the novel might have aroused. I raise this concern especially because so many novels set during the Jim Crow and Civil Rights Movement eras are described as redemptive, and without naming names, I don't see how they are. Even if they, like Christ, can save us from sin, I do not see readers acting to ensure the civil rights of the disenfranchised. If anything, I see these rights deteriorating. It is not just the race redemptive narrative with its distortion of history that I'm concerned about, but an array of stories of far-ranging subjects that somehow diffuse the reader's responsibility to act on the consciousness the story engenders by signaling to the reader that the problem is solved because the characters are happy. Critics have accused me of providing hopeless endings for my stories. Not so. I aim for realism, to provide a hopeful or even a deliriously happy ending where one is deserved is as much an imperative of narrative as to provide an unrealistic ending is to be avoided. In this regard, Anton Chekhov's stories are models for their ability to narrate a character's development through a crisis without unrealistic distortion or melodrama. Of course, melodrama sells and melodrama pleases, though it rarely persists as art. The truth is that it is more fun to read about injustice than to do something about it. We are, and I include myself, as Twain's Colonel Sherburne calls us, the average all-arounds, no better or no worse than any other person. He calls us cowards. I don't believe that. He says we don't want trouble. I do believe that. What we want is to be sheltered, well-fed, and happy. For many of us, reading is a part of that happiness, and yet literary reading so often challenges us to risk that happiness, to make trouble, to act on the sympathy the story arouses. If and how to act is a matter for each reader, I believe small but persistent acts such as letter writing, donating, volunteering, and teaching can have impact over time. Reading, too, can be a powerful tool for social justice, but we cannot allow ourselves to be lost in its firmament, but rather let us plant in the terror firma of the world we live in. With those thoughts in mind, it is my honor to bring to the stage Ruthie Yao and the author of The Vain Conversation, Anthony Grooms.
Hi, this is Tony.
And this is Ruthie. And I'll tell you a story about Ruthie. I remember Ruthie when she was a young child. She was the daughter of a former colleague at Kennesaw State, and she is now has a Yale doctorate and works at Georgia Tech. Um, oh, and yes, okay. Can everyone hear now? Okay. And I'm just so pleased to have this conversation with her. She's the author of Students of the Dream, a study of the resegregation of Marietta High School. So if you haven't seen that one, you need to see that. Harvard University Press.
Thank you, Tony. That was really overly generous. I'm totally like a starstruck kid. This is so exciting. And Tony's so humble. He said, I hope that we get 30 people. I was like, I think you will, Tony. So it's my pleasure to talk with him tonight. If you haven't yet read the novel, you're in for an experience. And I had the honor of talking with him about it. We did a brief trial run the other night. And so there are a few questions that I am anxious to ask him, but then I believe there'll be time for you all to ask him questions too. So can I jump right in?
Yes, let's jump in.
Will you talk to us about the title?
Yes, the title. So after looking around for a title and trying out a few that didn't work, professional people told me that. Professional title people told me that. But then I stumbled. A little trick that Ravi Howard, the novelist of Like Trees Walking, taught me this little trick, and that is to go to the Bible. And so looking through the Bible, recognizing that the novel is in part about redemption and what does that mean, I came upon a phrase from First Peter, in which Peter writes in his letter uh, the vain conversation of your fathers, referring to a tradition of sin. And I thought, how appropriate, a tradition of sin that's passed along generation after generation. This seems to fit the American experience. But I also like the title because it puns, and it puns, of course, on conversations. A vain conversation is a prideful conversation. We have a lot of those. We're having one on tweets right now. And and there's also conversation in vain, uh, a conversation that isn't progressive in some way, conversation that doesn't uh, result in moving along, whatever the problem is. So that title was almost taken away at the last minute, but it was saved by my stubbornness and some support from the writer Pam Durban, who said she also liked the title. So we kept it.
The novel is, and many of you may already know this, but about a lynching in 1946 at Moores Ford Bridge in Walton County, Georgia. Um, as a historian, I'm going to offer what many of you may also already know, which is that there were almost 4,000 murders by lynching between 1870 and 1950. So the novel documents the deaths of 4 people. But Tony, you said this is not a historical novel, but rather a work of fiction. So will you talk about that?
It is a work of fiction that draws heavily on the history of Georgia in '46 and other times I visit, but it is not a history of the Moores Ford Landing. That's where we begin with that idea, and this comes about because in 1991 I read in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution uh, a story about Clinton Adams, who, as a 10-year-old, had witnessed the murders of the 4 people in Walton County. There's still some controversy about the accuracy of his report and so forth. But what interested me was the idea of a person who had seen something horrific, and yet now for at that point some 40 odd years had no voice. He was afraid to talk about it, and his own testimony says that it really disrupted his life. Recently, the Atlanta Journal and Constitution again has had some articles on about Clinton Adams because the case has now been officially closed by the FBI and the GBI. So Adams was interviewed again, now in his 80s, and he still says that he is troubled and disturbed, even now for some 30 years or so. He has given some voice to that story. So I wanted to explore what happens uh, uh, to a person who has this burden to bear of having witnessed something awful, and in my story, he actually knows one of the victims. Uh, so how does he deal with his growing sense of his own culpability in this murder, even though he himself is a 10-year-old who's witnessed it? Uh, uh, what I'm hoping to do is to enlarge the idea a little bit, so that we look at ourselves and ask what are our roles in these terrible things that have happened in our past, and that happen even now as we sit here.
With that in mind, that this is a novel about an event um, for whom the perpetrators of which will never be held accountable, as in so many lynchings in the South. Um, Tony and I were talking about this, and he said that our national history is a history of suffering, but also a history of joy. And I want to know um, where and why we should and can find joy.
Well, the joy is in the cracks very often. But I am of a certain age. I think it's 25 plus, but nonetheless, um, I was born the year after the Brown v. Board, so I grew up in de facto segregation, and it's sometimes hard for younger people to believe, but segregation didn't end in 1954. uh, and so I grew up with that experience. Um, this and I was talking about this in terms of the soundtrack and thinking about Mississippi Burning and the sorrow song that is the soundtrack to that movie, and thinking, yeah, those things happened, but there was also the Supremes. That, yeah, yeah, there was also, my folks liked Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald on the Ed Sullivan Show. There was also James Brown, a little later in the experience. So there were places within families where there was, in fact, a great deal of joy. Uh, Outside of the family, you had to be careful, and many times, uh, that many times, in fact, what happened outside of the family comes into the house, comes into the family, and creates uh, trouble, tragedy, slaughter. But there were many opportunities for joy because I feel that I was a person, in my own experience speaking, nurtured by my parents and family, and nurtured by my community.
Those are the same parents who selected you
Hmm.
to integrate um, your when you were in sixth grade,
Hmm.
to integrate what was the local, I guess, high school, right? Because was it
Oh,
1-6 and then 7-12?
no, actually, it was an elementary school.
Elementary. Okay.
Yeah,
In
and
in
we
67?
yeah in '67 we didn't have a proper junior high school. So you went from elementary right into high school. And in my case, I went elementary right into high school, and then they changed the system, so I went back to junior high. Kind of reversal there. Uh, but in '67, and I was thinking about this the other day, how it all played out. So there was in my county a black educator named Alberta Guy Despot, and we always thought Mrs. Despot, you know. Uh, but she was actually a very nice woman and a very, as I think back on it now, brave activist. And one of the things she did when the state, after many years in the state of Virginia, remember, closed its schools rather than to integrate in the mid 50s. Charlottesville, the big city in my area, closed down for some months. And of course, to the south and in other places there in Virginia, things were closed. Um, so it's 67 now, nearly, I'm counting in my head, 12, 15 years after the Brown v. Board, that the county of Louisa decides it would do a freedom of choice. And the freedom of choice was, of course, you choose to stay where you are if you know what's good for you. Well, Mrs. Despot had a Christmas program where she invited certain parents. And in this Christmas program, I remember going and sitting and thinking, this is the dullest Christmas program I've ever been to. All that they're doing is the adults are talking, and Mrs. Despot is making a presentation, and then at the end of it, 5 or 6 children came up and sang Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and then we went home. Uh, a few days later, my father came to me and he said, "Sticks and stones might break your bones, but words will never hurt you. You're going to the white school." And we did, my sister and I, and a few other black children. So that was the beginning of a very interesting experience in my life for 3 years that I was pretty much the only black boy in anything that I did. There were a few black girls. And then in 1970, the federal mandate came, and the schools integrated fully. In a way, because in your book you talk about tracking, so the tracking occurred also in my experience. Um, but suddenly, after 3 years of being the only black boy, particularly in activities, suddenly there was this school half full of black children, and that was also a kind of a shock uh, to me.
So we talked a little bit about this, but the novel, all the blurbs you all are um, don't do the novel justice, but they do offer that it is a novel about the big themes, right? Progress, transcendence, universal love, redemption, salvation. But Tony and I were talking about that it's very much a novel about community and the contradictions and complexities of community in the Jim Crow. Will you speak to that a little bit?
Again, I'm drawing largely on my experience growing up in rural Virginia and how community during the Jim Crow period is put together there. There was not a spatial separation. Whites and blacks lived next to each other. But there was a very strong social separation, social hierarchy, if you want to think of it that way. So we knew many of our white neighbors, as I would think that my grandfather used to borrow a male pig, what's that called, a boar, to take care of business and make some bacon from one of his white neighbors. Um, so there was that kind of enterprise. People knew each other and got along with each other, but yet uh, in the 70s, when a young black man died, somewhat mysteriously, it was still the kind of place where people thought he was probably murdered because he was dating a white girl. So this is the complexity of the South, I think, and probably the complexity of most places in America, but particularly the South and the rural South, where people of different backgrounds, we think of it merely because it is the South as being blacks and whites, but other peoples too intermingle, but yet somehow socially and in terms of, and even in terms of government, sometimes we're kept apart. So that's part of the complexity I wanted to get at. But also there's uh, a, um, a psychological complexity within each character. There are reasons for what we do. And some of them are very honorable, some of them are well intentioned, and some of them are just plain wicked.
Well put. I wonder if you might tell the story about your grandmother, because the novel helps us understand that Jim Crow is also about these strange intimacies, some of which you're alluding to just now. This story about your grandmother, I think, helps us understand those.
Yeah, my we often were at my father's mother's place. It was nearby, and she cared for us and us being my siblings and other cousins. So there were a group of children there. She had certain rules, and one of these rules applied to which white people we could trust and which we couldn't. And she was so um, the the main person we could trust, who actually never came into the yard, never came to visit, was Dr. Whitley. And Dr. Whitley to my grandmother was, I guess, there was Jesus Christ, and then there was Dr. Whitley. And one of the things she noticed was that Dr. Whitley doesn't believe in segregation. Note his waiting room, which was uh, not a huge space, but it was divided by a very low wall, and it ended in a circular nurse's stand, so that the nurse could actually be in the black waiting room and talking across to the white waiting room. There were two doors to come in, but when you came in, you essentially came into the same room. So she believed very strongly that Dr. Whitley was making a statement with that design. The other three men were the forest ranger, the Postman, and the Watkins Man. Now, I don't know what the Watkins Man was really named, but he was a man who came by to sell household products and some very awful kind of vitamin mixture that wonderfully I would take. It was very bitter tasting, but it was always followed by a spoonful of bourbon and sugar. So I was a sickly child, but 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 my grandmother would carry on wonderfully with the Watkins man. She saw him come into the house, and they would sit, and I don't know all of what they talked about, but some of it was cleaning products and perfume, whatever he sold.
When you read the novel, if you haven't yet, you will experience the depth of detail and the sweetness, um, and all of the cutting rough edges that are these intertwined lives of folks who knew each other in these really particular ways, and of matriarchs who draw the line. Um, I want I want us to talk about the what the book is doing, with the past. You and I chatted a little bit about a usable past. Historians are always going on about a usable past. No one has ever read anything I've written, but I'm really excavating a usable past. And this story that you are telling us, I think, is a deeply usable past, but not in an easy way. So, can you talk about that?
I think the main use of the past in this novel is to open avenues for discussion about the present. We now, and the novel's called The Vain Conversation, and I'm known for my absolutely hopeless endings, except no, uh, they're not so hopeless. But I do not believe that we're not having conversations. I think that they're in all corners. There are these wonderful, quiet conversations. We are here, black and white together, etc. And a few from other backgrounds having a conversation about race. And so far, nobody's tweeted anything derogatory. But in our public life, on cable news, and of course from the president's office now, the story's so much more full of conflict, and so loud and yelling, and no one is sitting down to listen. And so part of what I wanted to get at a little bit is that we could have those conversations. My character, Lonnie, is constantly, when he's bothered by this lynching that he saw, and for many years, he's reaching out to people asking or telling them about the lynching. And actually, in one section, he's writing poems, because after all, what do? You write poems, right? Um, though they're not very good poems. But he's trying to explore what's happened to him, and also explore the American scene um, through this conversation. One of my favorite parts of the novel is when the husband and wife in the novel, uh, late into the night, she's baking cakes. She's disturbed. When she's disturbed, she bakes cakes, and they have this wonderful discussion. In my mind, at least, it was a wonderful discussion, just about the things, and they don't see eye to eye. So even within the black community, there are people not seeing eye to eye, and they're married, and they do love each other.
Bertrand says, hate will eat you up. Uh,
Yeah, and Llewellyn has a retort for that, but I'll let you read
well,
that.
before we go into question and answer, will you read a little excerpt for us?
Oh no, I don't think so.
So coy.
Happily. Um, Maybe I'll do the trick I learned from Ernest Gaines when asked to read, he just starts at the beginning. Um, and that's a good place to start because it doesn't really need a whole lot of context. Blackberries, blackberries. The boy's head was filling up with blackberries. He had moved slowly, deeply, and deeper into the bramble until he was surrounded by it. The tangle of vines arched above and around him so that it seemed that he had entered a cave of brambles. A gift from God, the boy thought. Light dappled through the vines, the thicket swayed gently in the breeze, and the fine thorns scratched against him. He didn't care. He was in the world of blackberries. He knew how to step through the bramble to avoid a serious scratching, and how to share the bramble with a black snake or ringed king snake, thrushes and chickadees, and sometimes a more brilliant bird like a yellow finch might land on a vine, bowing it, and then springing to another. Only the ticks bothered him. They hid in the brittle grass and broom sedge that edged the thicket. He rolled his pants to his knees and let them crawl up his naked calves until he could see them and pick them off. He left his pail at the edge of the patch, and with his cup in front of him balanced on one leg and leaned over the briars into the nest of plump berries. They were so fat that three of them filled his palm, and the season was just beginning. In spite of his eating one for every three he kept, the pail was filling nearly a gallon, and he had only been picking half an hour. A shadow passed over, and he looked up to see a turkey vulture. He liked them. They were like kites, the way they sailed on a breeze. Once, not far away, on Christmas Hill, he had followed a vulture back to its nest in the abandoned house on the adjacent ridge. It was an old settler's house, his father had told him. It was a two-story wooden house with a rusty weather vane in the shape of an eagle on top. The vulture had flown into one of the upstairs windows, so the boy went into the house, climbed the dry, rotted stairs to the second floor. Loose plaster crumbled under his feet, and he thought the creaking floor must be paper thin. In the second room of four, he came upon the nest. The stench stupefied him. Before he got his bearing in the guano splattered room, a bald, red faced, and completely white feathered chick, the size of a small chicken, rushed at him. It spewed vomit at him, so unnerving him that he took 3 steps at a time, tumbling more than running down the stairs. The chick was the ugliest thing he had ever seen, and yet it would grow into such a graceful and beautiful bird to look at in the air. At the end of the memory, he heard a rambling and puffing coming up the hill on the wooded side of the bramble. Once before, he had heard this sound, and a small black bear had run out of the woods. But there was something else, some popping and snapping of twigs. He heard a ripping of leaves and saw leaves floating down from high in the trees. Somebody was shooting. He squatted down in the briars. It got quiet for a moment. Then he heard men's voices and another shot, a snap from a little gun. It remained quiet for a few moments, and the boy crawled out of the patch and sneaked along the crest. Then he saw who the men were, and he felt relieved. They were Sheriff Cook and some other men. Two of the men were dragging something. He stood, thinking maybe they had shot a bear, but it would have been a bear with a flowered dress on. The seasons went through a cycle, and the boy just stood, getting a year older in a few minutes. His heart knocked against his ribs. He did not realize that the moment as prodigious and capricious as it seemed, was as deeply rooted and prickly as the blackberry vines. It was also a moment that jinxed him. The men were dragging a colored woman. She was dead. Thank you.